Hello and welcome to another edition of the Middle East Report. In this programme we'll be looking at Iran's controversial nuclear weapons programme. I'll be asking the questions, have we reached the point of no return? And with the latest explosions taking place at the Iranian Revolutionary Guards base that has caused the death of 17 Iranians, plus also the founding father of Iran's nuclear missiles programs, and those were the base of the Shihab-3 missiles that were capable of hitting Israel. Has the war already started with Iran? And secondly, the second issue we're going to focus on is the Iranian regime exploiting the Arab Spring by supporting dangerous Islamist groups in the Middle East, and what is the future for President Assad and the Syrian regime in light of what's happening in the Middle East. And to discuss these vital issues that are shaping today's Middle East, I'm joined once again by Dr. Mehrdad Khansari, Secretary General of the Green Wave and a supporter for freedom in Iran. Mehrdad, hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. It's good to have you on the programme again. You're on the programme in June, but for our viewers, can you just say a little bit about yourself and the movement and organisation you represent?
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program again. I have been an Iranian political activist for the last 30 years. I was previously an Iranian diplomat stationed in London, Washington, and the United Nations. So I've had some experience in diplomacy in the past, and I think that from very early on, following the victory of the Iranian Revolution, it became clear to many people within Iran that the country was not heading in the right direction. And I was one of the first to join the opposition, and I became an advisor to then former Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar, who was later assassinated in Paris. And I served as his foreign policy advisor for over 6 years. And I have been active on my own since then, and in the aftermath of the 2009 coup of Ahmadinejad and his clique of followers within Iran, and the changing dynamics of the internal situation in Iran, this Green Wave movement was founded by prominent Iranian businessman who asked me to join him in this adventure and in this endeavor. And so we formed Green Wave, and we have been active in trying to serve as an umbrella organization focusing on issues and people inside the country in order to try and find a solution for the future of Iran. Because at the end of the day, the best way to prevent the Islamic regime posing a danger to international peace and security is by using the Iranian people to change them, rather than anything else that West contemplates in terms of stopping the Iranian regime.
And Mehrdad, also, you're also a commentator on the BBC and on Sky and many other media platforms as a world-renowned expert on Iranian affairs.
Thank you very much. I have, obviously, when you are involved in this field for such a long time as I have been, you develop a certain amount of knowledge that sometimes people draw upon. And in this respect, I have been fortunate that I have been able to share some of my views with people via these channels that you mentioned.
And it's an honour to have you today
on
the Middle East Report. Mehrdad, what would you make of the latest report by the UN watchdog, the International Atomic Agency report on Iran's nuclear weapons program?
I don't think that the content of this report from the IAEA really surprises anyone. This is an issue that has been, discussed on the front burner for the last 7 or 8 years, since the discovery that Iran had been pursuing a nuclear program oblivious of its obligations to the IAEA. The question is Iran's nuclear program one that is simply for peaceful purposes, or is it something that it is not? This is an issue that the IAEA has never been able to clearly and solidly verify. And that is why there has been such a problem. And the Iranian regime insists that its program is totally peaceful. Yet, by not being clear about it and by accepting all kinds of sanctions that have placed such hardship on the Iranian people, it somehow gives a dubious impression as though if a country is pursuing a program that is entirely peaceful, then why subject itself to all these problems and all these hardships if by a simple stroke of cooperation with the IAEA it can eliminate all these? The fact that they haven't arouses suspicions in all quarters around the globe, even amongst some of Iran's closest trading and, you might say, political partners today, countries like Russia and China, who have supported United Nations Security Council sanctions against Iran. So even they are suspicious of Iran's intentions. Now the question is, was Iran simply pursuing objectives such as enriching uranium or developing a capability to enrich uranium, or have they been working on a nuclear weapons program plus the means of delivering that nuclear weapon to selected targets anywhere around the world? The importance, I think, of this latest IAEA report is that it essentially nullifies a national intelligence estimate that was issued by the United States government in December of 2007, in the dying months of the last year of the Bush administration, when that report claimed that it was their belief that Iran had essentially stopped working on a nuclear weapons program since 2003. What this report says is that Iran has been working on its nuclear weapons program since 2003. And as a result of that NIE estimate, a great deal of pressure was lifted from Iran, which now all of a sudden has to be re-exerted on Iran. And that is the problem, I think, that is posed by this present report. So the fact that Iran has been in violation of its obligations to the IAEA, everybody knew. The fact that Iran had been trying to achieve the know-how to develop a bomb, everybody knew. How advanced Iran was, that was the question, and now this report suggests that they've been working 24/7 on trying to develop a nuclear weapons while developing the missile technology for long-range missiles to deliver such warheads to certain selected targets. That is the danger, and that is what has caused this reaction in the international media as to what do you do with Iran at this particular stage, which of course leads to other questions.
We've got a clip to go to now that looks at the latest report by the IAEA on Iran's nuclear weapons program.
My previous report on implementation.
According to a report released by the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran has been working towards building a nuclear weapon since 2003. The report, which was handed over to the 35 member states of the IAEA Board of Governors, details a series of tests, acquisition of materials, and technology that suggests Iran has continuously worked to produce a nuclear weapon since 2003. France said on Wednesday it wanted to convene the UN Security Council and could push for unprecedented sanctions against Iran after an International Atomic Energy Agency report said that Iran had worked to develop an atomic bomb design. Foreign Minister Alain Juppé told RFI Radio that convening of the UN Security Council is called for. He said it was necessary to convince China and Russia, which are likely to oppose the Fifth Security Council sanctions resolution against Iran. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad said Iran won't retreat, quote, an iota from its nuclear program, but is strongly rejecting a UN report claiming that Tehran is seeking atomic weapons. Ahmadinejad chided the UN International Atomic Energy Agency, saying it is discrediting itself by siding with invalid U.S. claims that Iran is seeking to develop nuclear weapons.
Welcome back to Middle East Report. Mehrdad, this poses probably the biggest foreign policy challenge to any Western government, also Middle Eastern governments as well, the issue of Iran's nuclear weapons program. Now, what are the consequences for the stability and security of the Middle East and the West if Iran goes ahead and actually acquires nuclear weapons and the ability to deliver those weapons in terms of missile technology?
Well, I think first of all, you have to bear in mind that when you talk about Iran developing nuclear weapons, if you had a democratic Iran, a secular Iran, one in which it was properly represented by its people and the aspirations of its people, it was progressive, future-minded, you're talking about a different kind of a situation than when you're talking about an Islamic fundamentalist minority regime with a narrow view of the world, bent on promoting militant anti-Westernism around the globe without any hesitation, supporting every anti-Western organization that it can, and being of a mind that the state of Israel, for example, has to be wiped out from the map of the world, and things of that nature. So, you're not dealing with, a country that is run by properly educated, properly, you might say, positioned people who look to international peace and cooperation and progress as a way of advancing their own people. You're talking about a completely different kettle of fish with a completely different agenda. It's a revolutionary, anti-status quo regime that wants to change the rules of the game completely in the Middle East region and then in the world. This is the kind of rhetoric that has come out of people like Ahmadinejad and his cohorts. So the danger of these people being armed by a nuclear weapon obviously is tremendous and changes the game plan for the region. Many of the moderate countries in the region cannot stand for this. So they will have to strive to match Iran in this field, which means proliferation for the region. Even countries more distant, like Egypt, would have to opt for a policy of this nature, let alone countries next to Iran like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, or even some of the smaller Arab states who are terrified of Iran already, let alone Iran being armed with nuclear weapons. And of course, this also poses a great challenge to the West, because if Iran has the capability of, let's say, striking or potentially threatening a country like Israel with its long-range missiles at this time, it can have the capability of hitting targets in Western Europe as well. And this is something that can be extended as we go on in time, with Iran being able to develop longer range missiles and threatening even the United States, which is probably what is on the minds of the people in power currently in Iran. So it is a major threat to international peace and security. It has been seen as that, even in the current circumstances, by the entire membership of the Security Council, because they have already passed a number of resolutions trying to halt the Iranian nuclear program. But that has not been able to make any progress, and Iran has continued to defy the international will.
And talking about particularly Middle Eastern states, also talking about Iran's nuclear weapons program, with intelligence agencies suggesting that Iran may be 1 or 2 years away from actually acquiring the capabilities to launch nuclear weapons. Have we reached a point of no return where the only possible option left available to the United States or to Israel or even Britain would be to take preemptive military strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities?
This is very difficult to say. I don't personally believe that at this stage, we have reached that point of no return because of the technological impediments that have been forced on Iran, and the fact that these things have, with the sanctions and with all the international supervision that has already been in place, the Iranian nuclear program has not been halted, but it has been slowed down. So I would say that we have not yet reached the point of no return. Although, when you talk about 1 year or 2 years, this is a common theme that we've been hearing for the last almost 20 years, that Iran is within 4 years or 5 years, of attaining that position. But there is no question that today that position is far more dangerous than it was 10 years ago. And this time gap should be taken much more seriously than before. But the question is retaliation or preemptive strikes going to resolve this situation? I'm not convinced about that. And I don't think that that is something that we as an organization would welcome. I think the remedy lies in the Iranian people, changing a situation that is dominant in the country and bringing into power a government that walks away from options of this nature and turns Iran from one major, provocateur of unsavory ideology and action into a cooperative member of the international community, especially in this dangerous time when you're seeing the Arab Spring happen, but with unknown consequences. You don't know which direction it's going to go, whether it's going to go in the direction of adding greater stability to the region or more instability. One thing I can tell you for sure, and that is that the concept of political Islam in Iran is dead. Nobody is motivated by political Islam in Iran today. The people universally want change. And arming the people and helping the people attain that objective is the best way of relieving the international community of the dangers and problems that is posed by a minority clique that sees the acquisition of nuclear weapons as its only means for survival and for perpetuation of its rule in the region.
I mean, as you alluded to earlier in the interview, that the Iranian President Ahmadinejad has vowed to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, threatened the Jewish people with genocide. So you can understand from Israel's position that they're nervous about Iran, very nervous about Iran's development of nuclear weapons. Could it be a scenario, if they have the intelligence come through, that Iran is very close to developing weapons of mass destruction, the capabilities of actually launching nuclear weapons through its missile technology, maybe the Shihab-3 or Shihab-4, that you could actually see Israeli military intervention in terms of airstrikes that would drag the West into a wider war against Iran that could lead to a bigger regional war in the Middle East?
I mean, I can understand, and of course there's plenty of press reports and commentaries from Israeli officials to the effect that Israel will not tolerate this. I mean, one has to remember that Israel suffered, or the Jewish people suffered, a tremendous, horrific experience some 70 years ago, where some 6 or 7 million of their kindred were annihilated and destroyed. So they are not going to sit around for another 6 or 7 million people to be destroyed again at the hands of some irresponsible people who don't even represent maybe 5 or 10% of their own population. Now, the question is, will Israeli action lead to the kind of solution that they seek in order to avert this danger, or will this help trigger a wider scale war in the region? These are the questions that are at stake now. If Iran, for example, if Israel were to attack Iran, that does not necessarily mean that any Iranian retaliation would be such that it would bring in the West into some kind of a conflict. They could just retaliate against Israel and trigger some sort of use their assets like Hezbollah, their assets like Hamas, their long-range missiles to just hit Israeli targets, in which case it is not an automatic thing that the West would get involved. But the dynamics of the situation at the moment in the Middle East is such that it is unlikely that an action of this nature would not spark a greater regional war, in which case the West would have to be involved. And the cost of that would be tremendous. And it's here that I wish to make this very important point, that removing the Iranian regime prior to any kind of a military action, the cost of that will be borne by the Iranian people. In other words, it will be the sacrifice and the blood of the Iranian people, supported by the morally by the West and the international community in a meaningful way, would result and achieve will achieve the diffusion of this problem. If, however, this problem is allowed to continue while Ahmadinejad sits in Tehran and some kind of conflict starts, then the cost of attaining this all-important change will have to be borne by everyone in the region and potentially by a great many parties in the West. And that is the most important factor that has to be given consideration.
Which really leads me on to asking the question, is the West, is the American administration under President Obama, is David Cameron, our Prime Minister here in Britain, and the European Union doing enough to actually support the Iranian people? Because we saw the brave demonstrations after the presidential elections in 2009 with so many ordinary Iranians taking to the street. But is there not a fear now that the regime feels that it's clamped down on any internal opposition within the country, that any hope of another uprising within Iran could be short-lived?
I think that if you go back and you see what took place in June 2009 and the preceding months, and you look at the American administration, and you look at the reaction of President Obama to that uprising of the Iranian people, and the support he failed to give to them, in comparison to President Obama's, let's say, reactions to events that took place in Tunisia, Egypt, or even Syria today, I think that's an appalling record. The Iranian people were left to their own devices without even a single word of support. They don't expect the American Marines to come and save them, but they do expect for prominent Western figures to speak on their behalf and to give them the moral support they need and the encouragement to make the kind of sacrifices that they are making worthwhile and understood. That failure is something that is undeniable, you know. And but the fact is that why we are seeing, for example, uprisings in the streets of Syria and not in the streets of Iran has to do with a couple of factors. Number one is the fact that the Iranian regime and its repressive system is far more sophisticated than the Syrian one. As opposed to killing people in the streets, they arrest people, detain them and kill them and torture them in prisons. So they're not seen publicly to be doing that. But the level of repression in Iran today is no less than what it is in Syria, which everyone is watching quite closely on a daily basis these days. And secondly, the international support for the Iranian people has been nowhere near the kind of commentaries and support that we hear for being expressed for the people of Syria, or the pressure that is exerted on people like Assad, or kind of pressures that were exerted on the West's closest friend, Mr. Mubarak, or Gaddafi, or Ben Ali. So when you put these things into consideration, the Iranian issue looks a little bit more difficult, to say the least. But, you know, the fact remains that the majority of population have no hope. The economy is bad. Unemployment is well over 40%. Inflation is at an all-time high. Prospects for young people finding jobs in the job market is virtually nil. Out of every million or so graduates introduced to the Iranian job market in the last 10 years, at best, something like 20% have found jobs. And this has been an issue. So if you accumulate this figure for the last 10 years, it gives you a very easy picture of how the situation is. People who want to marry, who want to have kids, who want to have a future, all these things are blotted by a regime that has become smaller and smaller, a ruling establishment that has narrowed itself down to just a mere radical faction that is, you know, that has a stranglehold over the nation.
I want to talk about something that is very significant, and that is, it's believed, according to news reports, that Mossad have been behind an attack to blow up Shihab 3 missile base, which is controlled by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, as well as killing the founder and the architect of Iran's missile program. How will the regime perceive this attack, and what message does it send out to the actual regime?
Well, I mean, first of all, nobody knows for sure if this is a true account of what has transpired, although such an account is not beyond the realm of imagination. The fact is that the regime has said to the public that this was an accident, and the explosion was something that did not happen by any outside element, but merely by accidental process within the country. Now, but all this aside, the regime expects the worst. The regime is in a state of undeclared war with the West, with Israel, and with anybody that stands in its way. If these were not modern times, if we were still living in the 19th century, there would be no doubt that the Islamic Republic of Iran was in a state of war with, let's say, the United States, Great Britain, Israel, or some of the other major European powers. Now, when you are in that state, you expect the worst. You expect to be damaged in any way that you can. There is an economic war today being waged by the West against Iran. What are all these sanctions for? I mean, how do you interpret these sanctions if you're sitting in Tehran? This is an act of hostility. And why are the Western countries promoting a sanctions regime against Iran if it was not for hostile intent aimed at trying to force a situation whereby the Iranian regime withdraws from the policies that it's promoting? But the danger emanating from the Iranian regime does not simply stem from its nuclear program. As a militant, anti-establishment, anti-status quo regime, they are fighting Western interests and the status quo situation everywhere in the Middle East and in the Islamic world. Why are they supporting Hezbollah? Why are they supporting Hamas? Why are they supporting radical elements in Iraq? Why are they supporting Taliban, which is their archenemy, the biggest killers of Shiite Muslims in the last 100 years? Why? Only because of the fact that they shed Western blood and they kill all the allies of the Western governments in the region. So when you are living in a situation like that, you expect the worst. The question is, who can succeed and bring this matter to a successful conclusion? And the Iranian regime's intention all along has been, and this is a very, very important point, to keep the West occupied with events outside Iran in order to shield its weaknesses within Iran. It occupies the West in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Iraq, Israel, with the nuclear program, so that focus is not made on its very, very weak and increasingly weakening situation within Iran. If focus was made on that, if that was exploited, as King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia said in the WikiLeaks reports, the head of the snake would undermine. If that was eradicated, then the whole edifice in all these countries would fall. Support for all of these organizations that have been a thorn in the eyes of the regional states and of the Western governments, and a major threat to international peace and security would be diffused.
Got a clip to go to now, which is a recent news report of how the Iranian regime has been threatening Israel if Israel decides to carry out military action against the Iranian regime.
Iran's supreme leader has warned Israel against attacking his country. Ayatollah Khamenei said the Israelis should not try to launch any military attacks on Iranian territory, after the UN's nuclear watchdog said that Tehran appears to be working on an atomic bomb. The Iranian nation will fully respond to any aggression or threats in a way that will demolish them from the inside, Khamenei said. An International Atomic Energy Agency report says Iran is developing a nuclear test facility. Israel believes that could threaten its very existence and refuses to rule out the military option in tackling Tehran. Britain's Foreign Minister William Hague said the IAEA report had completely discredited the Iranian claim that its program is peaceful. Britain, the US and France want to impose new sanctions on Iran. That suggestion has been dismissed by Russia as unacceptable. Moscow says the latest report contains no new information on Iran's nuclear plans.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Mehrdad, I just want to move the conversation or the interview on a bit with you to talk about the Arab Spring and how is the Iranian regime exploiting the Arab Spring by supporting dangerous Islamist groups that is undermining the fragile democratic movement that we've seen this year sweep across Cairo and Tunisia and even Syria?
Well, I think one of the most important issues that has to be addressed is that people always, or analysts, when they speak about Iran and of the Iranian intentions for exporting their revolutions, there is a certain belief that Iran is after promoting Shiites around the world. Now, that is an aim of the Iranian regime, and that has been an aim of the Iranian regimes in areas where the Shiites, for example, have been in the majority, say in Iraq or in Bahrain, as we noticed in the last several months. But the Iranian objective at this time, and for the last, I would say, 2 decades, has been to survive in Tehran. To survive in Tehran, they have tried to promote and to engage, to promote a policy of engaging the West in other areas, as I mentioned before. Now that the Arab Spring has happened, there is the major threat that the democratic and secular-based aspirations of people who rose against dictatorship in places like Tunisia, Libya, and in particular Egypt may be hijacked by elements with an Islamic agenda which would run counter to those aspirations. Now, if that were to happen, then the West would be engaged in trying to deal with the fallouts from a policy that emanates by these people coming into power. The obvious perception is that these people would not be pro-Western as their predecessors, would follow completely different agendas, would be far more anti-Israeli, let's say, than the government of President Mubarak, or far less tolerant than people like Gaddafi or Ben Ali, who essentially talked a lot but did not do anything. And of course, were this trend to spread to Syria, which had the safest, let's say, border in the last 40 years with Israel, then the equation would change significantly in the Middle East. Now, the Iranian regime identifies this. So supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, let's say in Egypt or in Syria, or such elements in Tunisia or Libya, by financing them, helping them, in order to promote the kind of policies that they want, and utilizing the fact that they are probably the best organized groups at this particular time, after years of dictatorship in these places, would suit the Iranian objective, even though it has nothing to do with the promotion of Shiaism. It would suit them because it promotes militant, anti-Western groups in these countries, which would then strive to keep the West and Israel and its allies totally focused on these areas, which would mean leaving them alone, whilst they continue to survive and continue to perpetuate the rules by using the wealth of the Iranian nation, the oil wealth of the Iranian nation, to feed these elements and keep them alive. Now, this is a major, major danger, and we are seeing signs of it. The Egyptian elections are going to be held very shortly. It is predicted that the Muslim Brotherhood would come up with the largest single portion of the vote. Democratic, secular organizations within Egypt are weak. They may be a majority, but they are not together. They are not unified. We saw the same thing happen in the recent elections in Tunisia, where the Islamic elements or the Islamists won that election. And the dangerous fact was that they won an election which is to supervise the formation of a new constitution for the country. So they are going to have a major input into a new constitution that would have tremendous long-term effects, and changing that constitution at any future point is going to be a very difficult and arduous task. And we saw that the day after the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, the new president of the Transnational Council came and said that we want to create a state based on Sharia law. So all of these things do not, sort of offer a very promising future in terms of moving towards democracy, human rights, and the kind of issues upon which these campaigns were initially fought for. And the Iranian regime has a vested interest in supporting these, to helping these regimes keep to their agendas and to become strong and become potential allies of an Iranian regime that shares some of their values.
With Syria, for example, and we've seen the violent clampdown by President Bashar al-Assad on his people. I think it's now over 3,500 people have been killed. We've had here, I've got a copy of the Times here, the King Abdullah of Jordan interviewing the Times, calling for Assad to go and calling for the regime to go, to open himself up to democracy. We are seeing Syria being kicked out of the Arab League. We're having pressure from Turkey as well for the regime to stop this violence against its own people. We're seeing the condemnation of the world community on Syria. But Syria is Iran's closest ally, and so therefore if Bashar al-Assad is forced to go, what are the consequences for Iran's influence in Syria?
Well, I think that Iran is, number one, doing its utmost to ensure that Assad does not go. And that is why it has been providing funds and material support and technical advice and various kinds of anti-riot equipment and the like to the Syrian regime in order that they can manage to cling on to power. But they are savvier than to put all their eggs on the Assad basket, especially in the current situation where the tide is turning, the international tide is turning against him. And they know that the democratic organizations in Syria are weak because after 40, 45 years of, I don't know, many decades of dictatorship, these establishments have not been able to flourish. Whereas the Islamists have been far more organized within themselves and far more, there's been greater cohesion amongst them in terms of their agenda, and using elements like Hezbollah, which have been at their disposal, and using elements like Hamas or other radical Palestinian groups that have been based in Damascus. The Iranian regime has a great entree to all these, you might say, hardline Islamists today, who are today engaged in the battle against Mr. Assad. So it is not inconceivable to think that they would be financing certain elements at this very time that we are talking, although their main policy is to keep the Bashar government in power, in order not to be left out in the cold where Bashar Assad to go, and to have sympathetic elements in a prominent position for the post-Assad period. This is the kind of, you might say, policies that it is well within their sight and well within their capabilities of trying to address. Now, the fact is that were Bashar to fall, it would be a major setback for them in terms of public opinion within Iran. And that is why they have vested so much funds and prestige in order to try to keep him there. Because the consequences of that inside Iran would be significant, although it would not be a determining factor, because the Iranian situation and theater is completely different to the one in Syria, and change in Iran has nothing to do really with the Arab Spring. What happened in 2009 by the Iranian people in rising against Ahmadinejad may have sparked the Arab Spring.
Yes.
But the consequences of the Arab Spring will not necessarily lead to similar events happening in Iran, because Iran has its own dynamics and potentially far more explosive dynamics than what we have witnessed so far in the Arab Spring.
We have a news clip to go to now. This is produced by a Christian Science Monitor, and they're a think tank who deal with international relations. And this is their perception of what is currently taking place in Syria.
But Syria is very, very important to the Iranians, and we heard evidence of this when we spoke to the Syrians who were fleeing into Turkey, because many of them described how there were Iranian snipers who were engaged, like Iranians, people that they sometimes would capture but had no identity cards on them or anything else, and guess what? Didn't speak Arabic, just spoke Farsi. So anyway, these are kind of shock troops that have been sent in, because really, at this moment, nothing matters more to Iran's kind of regional worldview and its ambition of demonstrating itself as a real regional player than having Syria there as a critical cog. And why is Syria important to Iran? Because it's a mechanism, it's a tool for exerting its soft power. It gives weaponry to Hezbollah using Syria, same thing with Hamas, but beyond that, it also allows Iran to say, we as the kind of head of the axis of resistance, we are part of a Sunni, Shia, we're all together in this idea of resistance. But Syria is the only Sunni part of that picture. So if Syria goes, all of a sudden Iran is going to find itself a lot more isolated, going to find itself in a lot more, strategic trouble. And in any event, the Iranian influence in the region really has been dropping precipitously. In fact, there was a poll that just came out. Dan wrote a back channels about it. Poll that just came out of Arab attitudes about Iran. And I mean, Iran is offering nothing as an example that people want to emulate in the region. We've had the supreme leader, especially after the fall of Mubarak in Egypt. We had the supreme leader of Iran say, "This is all part of an Islamic awakening, and people are going back and learning the lessons from the 1979 revolution." And they're all describing this as one great, fabulous thing for Iran. Well, that may be true when you're dealing with kind of pro-American dictators like Mubarak, Ben Ali, or something like that, but it's a completely different story when we're talking about people power in Syria. Well, those guys, the Iranians dismiss them as seditionists, in the same way that they dismiss their own people power Democrats as seditionists. So anyway, Iran has been losing very, very much in the strategic picture here.
Welcome back to the Middle East report. Mehrdad, we first of all looked to the Arab Spring emerge in the beginning of the end of 2010, December in Tunisia, spread to Egypt, spread to Libya, and we've seen regime changes throughout North Africa. We've seen the violence and the upheaval in Syria, plus also upheaval in Jordan and also in Bahrain as well. But this promised an opportunity for a new dawn in the Middle East, one of democracy, one of liberty, one that would actually free the people from dictatorship and tyranny. And yet, as you said earlier in the earlier part of the interview, it seems that the Arab Spring now has become dominated by organised groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, who are serving a very dangerous Islamist agenda. Are we reaching the point where secularist movements, democratic movements within the Middle East are being crushed and not being able to have a voice and a say and an influence in the future of the region?
I think I would agree with what you just said, and the most important factor to bear in mind is that over the last 30, 40 years, the rise of Islamist movements or political Islam is mainly because of the failure of secularism in the Middle East as a whole. Secular governments have failed to deliver the aspirations of the majority of people in this region. Whether it's the humiliations that they suffered as a result of wars with Israel by secular governments or military governments that ran the country on a secular basis, or whether it was internal corruption or alleged association with Western governments, as was the case, let's say, in Iran, which led to the rise of the Islamic Revolution and the fall of the late Shah of Iran. So when we look at the Middle East as a whole today, we see that secularism comes with this baggage and is in need of being rejuvenated and helped, because in the long run, only through secular democratic government can true progress and salvation come to these people. This does not mean that secular governments are anti-religious, but the question is that religion has to be privatized in the Middle East, and that by privatizing religion, you create a situation whereby all people can flourish. Now, the most important thing, again, I want to make this distinction. The only country in the Middle East to have actually experienced, the only major country to have actually experienced an Islamic government coming on an Islamic agenda, running the country or trying to run the country on the basis of Islam or deriving its legitimacy from Islam is Iran. In Iran, political Islam has failed. In Iran, political Islam means nothing. People want secularism. Secularism is coveted. In the other countries, because they have not experienced what the people of Iran have experienced, there is this short-term gap which the void might be filled by these Islamists, and if encouraged by Iran or financed by them, it will be. The important thing is to ensure that they do not establish an Islamic dictatorship in these countries that prevents the rise of secularism through as we go on in time.
I think we're down almost to the last 2 minutes of the interview, Mehrdad, which has been very informing and very enlightening. What is the future for the green wave movement that you head up in Iran, and what is the chance that the Iranian people will be able to seize the opportunity for freedom and liberty in your nation?
I think that this is a matter, change in Iran is inevitable. It's a matter of time. And our strategy in Green Wave is to bring this change with the support of elements that are running the country at this time. They can be, in other words, the strategy in simple terms is to create a situation whereby elements who are currently supporting the system should turn their allegiance and support the people. And by contacting them, by having relations with them, by assuring them that this is the only way for the future of Iran can this change happen. People in the Revolutionary Guards, for example, that are part and parcel of the system, they must understand, and they do understand. They believed in Islam, they believed in Khomeini, they believed in the revolution. These issues are not there. They have acquired power and wealth. They will lose all of that, just like the generals of Saddam Hussein did, unless they side with the people, and I think that they are savvy enough to understand that.
Mehrdad, I just want to thank you very much for being my special guest today on the Middle East Report, and you're always welcome on the set, and I just want to thank you for your excellent contribution to the programme. I just want to leave you with a song. This is dedicated to the Syrian people, but also to the Iranian people. And we need to stand with the Iranian people and also the Syrian people against oppression and tyranny, and ensure, like Mehrdad said, that a reign of terror, of Islamist terror, does not prevail in the Middle East, but the chance of liberty and freedom are given to the people. So thank you for watching the Middle East Report today.
Tens of years, dictators and the regimes feared. Ben Ali Mubarak now exiled, Bashar al-Assad you're next. Like the people were silent, and their voices were muted, mouths sewn shut with violence. Outcasts found themselves uprooted. Now is the time to clear, time to deal with the silence in here. From the shadows the ghosts persevere. With freedom of speech many voices appear. Now is the time to clear, time to deal with the silence in here. Back in the shadows the ghosts persevere. With freedom of speech many voices appear. First world leaders made deals with these crooked dictators. As long as it looked good on paper, and they got re-elected politician fakers. Yeah, people stand up everywhere. No one is free while others are slaves. When the world speaks, do you hear? Or do you have a deaf ear and a blind eye to the graves? Now is the time to see, time to let the people be free who have disappeared. Come home after all these years. I see a storm and feel the rain of your tears. Now is the time to clear, time to deal with the silence in here. From the shadows the ghosts persevere. With freedom of speech many voices appear. Now is the time to clear, time to deal with the silence in here. Back in the shadows the ghosts persevere. With freedom of speech many voices appear. Can you hear them? It's time to hear them. This is the year of change in the Middle East, and you can watch the exchange of power from dictator to democracy. No more hypocrisy from our bureaucracy. No more going backwards, there's nothing we can teach them. Led by example, and people want freedom. Time for the dictator's regime end. They can keep a man down, but all together we can beat them. Now is the time to clear, time to deal with the silence in here. From the shadows, the ghosts persevere. With freedom of speech, many voices appear. Now is the time to clear, time to deal with the silence in here. Back in the shadows, the ghosts persevere. With freedom of speech, many voices appear.